Well, hello again. I am still Mr. Laskowski, your faithful teacher, and the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. As you take notes on this presentation, remember that it is equally important to pay attention and to create a written record of what you've been paying attention to. Now, it's tempting to speed through this or any presentation at 2.0 speed, and who could blame you? But if you haven't paid close attention or taken great notes, you might just have to come back and rewatch sections of this presentation, and that is simply inefficient. So, here's a pro tip. Do it right the first time, and you won't have to spend extra time relearning this material. So do it. Be a pro. Starting right now. Let's get into it. Now this picture here should look familiar because it was the very same image we used to begin our slideshow on Jacksonian democracy. And that makes sense because we're picking up right where we left off at the end of the previous presentation. You see, all of this material was just part of Roman numeral 1. And because history makes sense, that means we will be picking up with Roman numeral 2. But before we do, let's remember that we're still talking about this antebellum period. That is, ante, before, bellum, the Civil War. And from what you've learned studying the age of Jackson, you can see how sectional tensions over democracy and Native American removal, not to mention tariffs, nullification, and the Second Bank of the United States helped move the country closer to a breaking point. And we'll see that some cultural and social forces will help to sow the seeds of division too, and that is the subject of today's presentation. And more than anything else, it was disagreements over the issue of slavery that both caused and widened these divisions. And we can't talk about slavery without mentioning John C. Calhoun. Often when students see this image of Calhoun, it's accompanied by a jump scare because he looks truly terrifying, like he was being photographed either just 5 minutes before he died or 5 minutes after he died. But there is another reason that this image is terrifying, and it's because Calhoun is modeling a unique grooming style. The neckbeard, or as I prefer to call it, the neared. I don't expect it to catch on here in the 21st century, but you can always hope. In your readings thus far, you might have heard Calhoun credited, if that's what you want to call it, with referring to slavery as the peculiar institution. And he did say that, and history students for decades have been weaving his phrase into their essays about slavery. Maybe you'll do that too. But before you do, let's take a minute to think about the word peculiar, because it's a word that is, well, peculiar, and it means something different than it did back in Calhoun's time. Today, we think of it as meaning strange or abnormal, out of the mainstream. There's often a negative connotation or a subtle tone of judgment when one person calls another peculiar. But this is in no way what Calhoun meant when he said slavery was a peculiar institution. By describing slavery as the peculiar institution, Calhoun simply meant that slavery was unique to the South, and so people in the North and West couldn't understand the Southern culture and economy that relied upon slavery, or why Southerners would go to such extraordinary lengths to practice it and protect it, even if it meant nullification or conflict or even secession. So how did we get there? Well, depending on which class you are in and how long it took us to finish the last unit, there's a good chance that you've seen this material on this slide. If it sounds familiar, if it starts to sound familiar, feel free to skip forward a couple of minutes. But for those of you who haven't learned this yet, or for those of you who just like to have a complete record, a complete set of their notes, well, go ahead and sharpen your pencils as we'll cover a quarter of a century in the history of American slavery, all in one slide. And we start in the aftermath of the American Revolution, that conflict in which colonists declared that all men were created equal and should be treated that way. Of course, for many of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, the definition of all men did not include enslaved people. Surely for some it did, and we saw some states move to outlaw slavery in the wake of independence, as they, rightly, viewed the institution as incompatible with the ideology of liberty. Then, in one of the very few things that the Articles of Confederation government actually accomplished, it passed land ordinances which established guidelines for how Western lands should be settled. This included the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which divided the area into 5 major territories that would eventually become states and, importantly, outlawed slavery in those territories. And so, with many northern states having outlawed slavery after the Revolution and the Northwest Ordinance forbidding it in the Western territories, slavery indeed grew to be an institution that was peculiar to the South. At the Constitutional Convention, positions for and against slavery had hardened, so much so that they couldn't come up with a compromise to settle the issue. These were the people who had adopted the Connecticut Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise, but slavery was off limits. In fact, even talking about the possibility of ending the international slave trade, not ending slavery, not ending the domestic slave trade, merely the importation of newly enslaved people. That was an issue that was so contentious that the only way to move forward was to write a phrase into the Constitution pledging not to even discuss this issue until 20 years had passed after ratification. Talk about kicking the can down the road and postponing responsibility. This terrible option was the only one that Southern enslavers would accept, and so when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, we could start the clock on those 20 years, during which time enslavers felt free to purchase as many people as they could afford. Of course, the reality about slavery in 1788 was that it was beginning to decline in profitability. Enslavers faced competition from other countries, and savvy businessmen could reap incredible profits by embracing the industrialization that was transforming the European countries and some northern cities. One could almost imagine slavery simply dying out one day, were it not for an invention that truly changed the world. In the early 1790s, Eli Whitney invented a hand-operated machine that mechanically separated cotton fibers from the seeds found deep in each boll of cotton. This sped up the process so much so that, as Whitney himself described it, now, quote, "one man and a horse will do more than 50 men could do on their own." And you might think that this would mean that enslavers would need fewer enslaved people, but what it really meant was now they could grow a whole lot more cotton and be able to get it all processed and sold in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost that it had taken previously. So if slavery had been slowly dying out, now it roared back to life. And it didn't hurt that the Louisiana Purchase enabled the United States to suddenly double its size, opening up hundreds of thousands of square miles to settlers, farmers, and, yes, enslavers. Now, in 1808, as soon as the Constitution said they could, Congress did indeed outlaw the international slave trade. Now, while this might seem like a step in the right direction for those who don't like slavery, please remember that this act didn't outlaw slavery or even the domestic slave trade. It just meant that the country would no longer import enslaved people. And enslavers had spent the last 20 years buying enslaved people from abroad, such that as soon as the market was cut off, that imposed scarcity on this human commodity, which means that with a stroke of a pen, each enslaved person became that much more valuable, meaning that enslavers became that much more wealthy. You see, even when things sound like they're moving in the right direction, they're not. So, if we jump past the War of 1812, of course, in which pro-slavery war hawks such as Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun hoped for war with Britain in order to gain more land for agriculture and, one assumes, the practice of slavery, well then our next stop is the Adams-Onee Treaty, You'll remember that this was the result of Andrew Jackson's quasi-legal invasion of Florida and the international incident with Spain that John Quincy Adams had to clean up. The result was Florida becoming part of the United States. Yay, Florida! How incredibly exciting that we get Florida! I am overjoyed. But it also meant that a large amount of new territory was now open to slavery. And less than a year later, the fissures between the non-slavery states and the pro-slavery states would widen significantly over the issue of Missouri. Missouri, really? Yes, really, Missouri. You see, in 1819, this territory, which had been part of the Louisiana Purchase, now asked to be admitted to the Union as a state where slavery would be legal. And that was a problem, because up until that point, there had been a relative balance between the number of free states and slave states. And the line between them, between the blue area and the red area on this map, was the Ohio River, such that slavery was outlawed north of the river, but allowed south of it. So what to make of slavery in Missouri, which isn't really north of the Ohio River or south of it, but west of it? What do we do with Missouri? Most Northerners in Congress feared that allowing Missouri to spread slavery into the West would just be a first step, and eventually slave states would vastly outnumber the free states. And so one of these people, a New York representative named James Talmadge, introduced an amendment which said that slavery could exist in Missouri, for now, but that no new enslaved people could be brought into Missouri, and each enslaved person would be freed upon his 25th birthday. Now, this Talmadge Amendment didn't outlaw slavery, but it did develop a plan for the eventual end of slavery. And a lot of Northerners thought this was a great idea, but almost no Southerners did, which is why it failed. And so Missouri statehood stalled in Congress. Well, that is, until the great compromiser, the great pacifier, none other than Henry Clay, swooped in to save the day. And he reckoned that he could maintain the balance of slave and free states by convincing Massachusetts to let its land northeast of New Hampshire become its own state, a state called Maine. And so Missouri would allow slavery, Maine would not, and the balance would be maintained. But Clay knew that he had to make a plan for the future in order to avoid being in the same situation the next time a new state wanted to join the Union. And so, after much deliberation, he proposed that future states north of the 3630 parallel, that is, the southern border of Missouri, should not allow slavery, and that future states south of that line should allow slavery. This proposal, which came to be known as the Compromise of 1820, or more famously, the Missouri Compromise, solved the immediate problem about what to do with Missouri statehood. And more importantly, at least in the mind of Henry Clay, it settled forever the issue of slavery in the Western Territories. Asterisk. Now, looking at the 3630 line, you can see that the amount of free territory, kind of purplish on this map, is a lot bigger than the amount of slave territory, the orangish area on the map. And perhaps you can understand why Southerners, looking at this map, thought, well, if we can only add new territory south of the 3630 line, maybe we should just claim some land in, Spanish Mexico, like Texas. And they would, but that is a topic for a future chapter and a future presentation. So, did the Missouri Compromise settle the issue of slavery in the Western Territories forever? Well, not if you ask Thomas Jefferson. Remember, this is the guy who bought the land that contains Missouri, as well as all of the rest of the purplish and orangish territory. When he heard about the debates over slavery in Missouri, Jefferson wrote, "The momentous question of slavery in the Western Territories, that is, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once as a death knell of the Republic." What? That slavery would rip apart the nation? Yes, that's it. It is indeed hushed. It is hushed indeed for the moment, thanks to the temporary fix of the Missouri Compromise. But this is a reprieve only, not a final sentence. And so if it sounds like Jefferson is saying that the question of slavery in the Western territories would so divide the country that it might result in a civil war, it's because that's precisely what he is predicting. Now, Jefferson got a lot of things wrong in his life. We don't have the time to count all of them up. But on this one, he got it exactly right. When might that death knell come? Well, keep reading your textbook to find out. When we think of the ways that enslavers tried to justify the continued and expanded practice of slavery, it's really easy and simplistic to lump them into two major groups. First, there were the Calhouns of the world who were unapologetic about slavery and believed that it was a positive good, benefiting enslavers, the enslaved, and society as a whole. Then there were the Jeffersonians, who believed that slavery was wrong, because of course it's wrong to hold other human beings in bondage, but that the practice of slavery was integral to the American economy, especially in the South. And so even though it might be evil, it is a necessary evil, a high but essential price to pay for the United States to grow into the great nation that she would one day become. Lumping people into these two groups is easy, but it is a bit lazy too, because in reality, it's a continuum, and there are a lot more nuanced and varying opinions on slavery. Now, this chart I have for you is not exactly scientific, but it attempts to show that the Calhouns of the world were truly the extremists, and they were in a tiny, tiny minority of all Americans, and even a tiny minority of those who justified the practice of slavery. Far on the other end of the continuum are the William Lloyd Garrisons of the world. They're the people who see slavery for the evil that it is, and they say every single enslaved person must be freed. That's emancipation. Today, immediate, without paying the enslavers anything, uncompensated. The result is immediate, uncompensated emancipation. At this time, Garrison was a lonely voice crying in the wilderness, and you can see that his ideas were pretty much just as unpopular as John C. Calhoun's were. In truth, most people in the country, even if they had an opinion on slavery, viewed it with varying degrees of skepticism. Some saw it the way Jefferson did, as an evil but necessary, while others thought that its costs outweighed its benefits and should be limited in some way. Actually, the failed Talmadge Amendment was in this category. It wasn't trying to abolish slavery, just stop its spread. So there really wasn't a lot of popular support for bold, dramatic action on the part of Congress, either way, in terms of permanently protecting slavery or immediately abolishing it. And because there wasn't that support in Congress, that's probably why nothing actually got done in Congress on the topic. So without action at the national or state level, what could be done about slavery? Well, some enslavers decided to take matters into their own hands, choosing to free their enslaved people by a legal process called manumission. They would sign official documents like the so-called Freedom Papers you see here, essentially saying that a certain individual was no longer the property of the enslaver. Sometimes it was guilt that led enslavers to manumit their enslaved people. Sometimes the enslaved people or people on their behalf were able to purchase the freedom of the enslaved person. But in so doing, it brought up another issue. Previously, most of society could be divided into enslaved black people and free white people. But with manumission came a relatively new class of people, free African Americans. So would these people be able to own property? Would they be able to move about the country freely? And if they were no longer 3/5 of a person, were they 5/5? Were they 0/5? Could they be full American citizens with the right to vote and to serve on juries and to have their civil rights protected by the Constitution? These are excellent questions, but ones without easy answers. With or without full rights of citizenship, free African Americans faced another question. Would their families be allowed to live next door to white families? Could they work together? Could they intermarry? Essentially, could they be integrated into white society, or would they be separated and segregated? Well, not surprisingly, Thomas Jefferson had an opinion about this too. Way back in 1787, he wrote about what might happen if some enslaved people got their freedom. To him, there was no way that he could ever envision an integrated society, partly because of white supremacy, partly because the black population could never forgive white people for what they had done to them in slavery, and what they continued to do to them at this time. As he put it, deep rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, will divide us into parties and produce convulsions which will probably never end but in the extermination of the one or the other race. Every time I look around my joyously diverse classroom full of brilliant scholars, I celebrate just how wrong Thomas Jefferson was. But even if he couldn't envision a functional, integrated society, he wasn't the only one who favored a permanent segregation. And that's what brings us to the American Colonization Society. At first blush, the ACS sounds like a well-meaning group of people trying to right the wrongs of slavery by freeing people and sending them back to Africa. But in truth, the society wasn't really interested in emancipation. It wanted to remove free African Americans from white society, and that by sending them out of the country. And as such, the ACS had its greatest support among powerful enslavers like Presidents Jefferson and Madison and Monroe, along with Henry Clay, and some segregationist Northern members of Congress as well. That is a lot of political muscle, and it enabled them to raise a lot of money and eventually create Liberia, what would become at least the nation of Liberia. Now, in theory, this was a place for free African Americans to go and live freely and have autonomy over themselves and their society. And while some folks were convinced of this by this sales pitch, others were coerced into going, while a much larger number of free black people just rejected colonization in favor of fighting for their rights here in the United States. In the end, only a couple thousand free black people took the trip back to Africa. So this so-called problem of free African Americans remained unsolved. And so it will have to remain unsolved for another short while, because now we need to take a moment and talk about the status of women. And here we need to talk about the public sphere, the private sphere, and the impenetrable barrier between them in most aspects of society, at least at this time. For as long as patriarchal societies have existed, so too have there been gender differences in terms of social roles. Most commonly, in a traditionally patriarchal society like the United States in the early 19th century, we divide these into two realms or spheres. First, there's the public sphere, which has historically been the exclusive domain of men. It's where business and trade are conducted, where laws and political decisions are made, and where economics and education help to solidify man's dominance in society. Contrast that with the private sphere, which, although nominally ruled by men in the family, is generally administered on a day-to-day basis by women, often mothers or grandmothers. This includes care for the home, care for families and for children, and the moral and spiritual development of family members. In between these spheres is a barrier that men can cross every time they leave or come back home, but women simply cannot cross without encountering significant social stigmas. This is where the phrase comes from: a woman's place is in the home. That's her place, her domain, her realm, her sphere, the private one. Now, this is not to say that women in these societies were trapped on their farms or couldn't go to a store. They could, but they didn't leave home to work or earn a paycheck or serve in politics or in any way participate in what we might call the public economy. Actually, there is one exception to this rule, and it's been an exception for thousands of years: prostitution. Indeed, prostitution has often been referred to as the world's oldest profession, primarily because it was the only one that women could participate in without encountering scorn, derision, or backlash. But I should emphasize here, prostitution was almost always the result of economic necessity, in which a woman, left destitute and alone, impoverished and starving, might have no other commodity to offer than that of her body. Like Fantine in Les Miserables, she would rather work, of course, but she would rather fend for herself, of course, but having been fired and still needing to provide for her sickly child, Fantine had no other option left. And so women like Fantine can participate in the public economy, but only in the most dire of circumstances. Well, for women in the early 19th century, there were very few opportunities for women to cross into the public sphere, but there were some. These included the Waltham system, sometimes called the Lowell system because it was introduced in a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, which welcomed poor girls and women to work in the mills. The jobs gave them a meager salary, first because the work was what we might call entry level, and second because owners could get away with paying women less, because of the same phenomenon that keeps women's pay significantly lower than men's pay 2 centuries later, and it's this. Employing women has historically been viewed as either supplementary or temporary, and I'll say that twice for effect. Employing women has historically been viewed as either supplementary or temporary. That is, when a factory owner hired a man, he might assume that the man had a wife and a family at home, and so, as the head of the household, he needed a higher wage to help him provide for his family. But if a woman went into that same factory, that same owner might assume that she is only there to supplement her husband's income, and so he wouldn't need to treat her like she was the chief breadwinner or the head of the household. And this is what I mean by supplementary. Alternatively, a girl or woman who might enter the workforce while she was still single, and so when the owner was paying her, he might pay her less because he knew he only needed to pay her long enough to survive until she could find a man to marry, a man who would then take her out of the public sphere and put her into the private sphere. Temporary. And so if you're thinking to yourself, thank goodness we live in more enlightened times, well, think again. Over the past few decades, the so-called gender gap between what women and men make for doing the same work has remained constant, with women making about 82 cents for every dollar that a man makes. When I was young, that number was 78 cents for every dollar. So we're making progress, kind of. So women in this time period who entered the workforce were usually drawn from the lower classes of society. And they worked due to profound economic distress and necessity. And as such, they were looked down upon by the women in the middle and upper classes. The most obvious thing I'm going to tell you today is that women in the upper class did not have the economic necessity to enter the public sphere. And so they didn't. And they tended to think less of those who did, believing that women of sophistication and refinement would never sully themselves by engaging in labor for pay. After all, isn't that what prostitutes did in their minds? And no less significantly, middle-class women, who probably could have benefited from a few extra dollars in the family piggy bank, usually preferred to be associated with women in the upper class to women in the lower class, and so they tended to follow the lead of wealthier women, staying in the private sphere, sacrificing economic security for social status. But let's remember that these middle and upper class women did not believe that their lives had no public significance at all, quite the contrary. You might remember the concept of the Republican motherhood. While firmly entrenched in the private sphere of raising families and teaching values, so-called Republican mothers raised their sons to emulate the founding fathers and embrace the ideals of the Revolution. And they raised their daughters to marry and then raise their own sons to embrace the ideals of the Revolution. And through such actions, they reasoned, the country would continue to be led by good and worthy men across the generations. but always men. Now, curiously, around this same time emerged an emphatic embrace of the idea that women belonged in the private sphere and, in fact, thrived there. This was the culture of domesticity, which is often shortened to the cult of domesticity or the cult of true womanhood. This culture emphasized and celebrated women's femininity and her value to the family and to the home. A true woman in this worldview embodied four ideals: piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. Piety, of course, meant religious devotion and teaching such devotion to the children. Purity was associated with both sexual chastity and the avoidance of alcohol, called temperance. Domesticity meant caring for the home and the family, and submissiveness meant deferring to husbands in all matters that might be considered the man's realm. Now, this cult of domesticity had a lot of interesting manifestations, starting with naming conventions for children. Strong biblical girls' names such as Mary, Sarah, and Martha, or virtuous names like Ruth, Prudence, and Faith, gave way to decorative, floral names such as Rose, Ivy, Violet, and Lily. Lovely names, and no judgment if you have one of those types of names. But what is the function of a rose? Well, in the mind of the people back then, the function of the rose was simply to look pretty, to smell good, and then to die. And so the embrace of hyperfemininity led to some interesting, if not always healthy, developments also in women's fashion. So you can learn a lot about the values of a society by looking at the clothes worn by the people in that society. Maybe at this moment right now you are wearing a t-shirt advertising your favorite team or a musician you love. And in so doing, you are advertising what you value. A hoodie and sweatpants, which is the uniform of the post-pandemic world, shows that you value comfort over style. And good for you. When you dress up on game days and for chapels, you are showing that you belong to this community, that you are part of it, that you are a member of the team. So what do these outfits you see in front of you say about the values of the society in which these women might wear them? Well, first of all, you might notice that each woman is covered with fabric from head to toe, suggesting an embrace of purity, or if you want to go back to the Puritans' sumptuary codes requiring modest dress, it might also be piety. But the lace, the ribbons, the silk, and other luxurious fabrics, not to mention just how much extra fabric those huge skirts require, well, all of this certainly projects affluence and opulence, two things exclusive to women in the upper class. When students see these pictures, they usually notice the fact that the woman on the left seems to have no neck, while the waistlines for all of them seem unnaturally tiny. And indeed they are. Now this is the result of women being cinched into extraordinarily tight corsets. While wearing clothes like these, or lacing or corset so tightly that it's hard to breathe and a woman's internal organs might get squished together. That might not have been what happens on an everyday basis, but it does explain why women in this period were so prone to fainting. Because if you've ever been suffocated by a boa constrictor, and who among us hasn't, then you've probably got bigger problems than this AP final exam. But you might also know then that when they wrap around a person's waist, they wait until the person breathes in, and then they tighten their grip so that the person can't breathe out. And so the person tries to breathe again, and then they can't breathe out. And eventually, the person just passes out from lack of oxygen, and the boa is able to crush the rib cage of its victim. Well, here we see that the women seem to be doing it to themselves. But why, you might ask? Well, to put it simply, it's to accentuate the narrowness of the waist by putting it in contrast to the hips and the bust. And these are dresses that are usually designed by men aimed at appealing to the male gaze, which might qualify as domesticity or submissiveness or both. But what a woman wearing dresses like these can't do is physical labor. What they can do, to borrow a phrase from a recent pop song, is to sit still, look pretty. Like a flower that looks pretty and smells good and then dies. Now, this is a cartoon of that period, but it illustrates the notion that sometimes the huge skirting on a woman's dress or outerwear could be so large that that woman could not even make it out the door, which is kind of the point for those embracing the cult of domesticity when she is physically trapped in the private sphere. Quick side note, learning about 19th century women's fashion might or might not be your jam, but it is a good reminder that you never know what part of this course you're going to wish you had paid closer attention to. Years ago, Lord and Lady AP decided that that year's DBQ should be on the ideals of womanhood in the years leading up to 1850. Those who took good notes on this section left the exam smiling. Those who didn't. And so it stands to reason that if women's roles were defined by their social classes, so too were the experiences of children. In some cases, economic necessity pushed young children into the public economy, into the workforce. No school for them, just work, now and for the rest of their lives. In keeping with the Les Miserables motif, this picture is that of Cosette, the daughter of the worker-turned-prostitute Fantine, sent to work for an innkeeper man and his wife. How different is this picture from this picture? Here, of course, the children are gathered around a little table with a little tea set. They're well dressed, and around the scene you can see a dolly, a pet dog, a book, and generally an atmosphere of play. Very unlike the picture of poor Cosette. And that is the difference. Cosette is poor, these kids are not. And that means that they have the money, the safety, and therefore the opportunity that might allow these kids to be kids. And this too is one of the products of the cult of domesticity. Well, now that we've talked about purity and domesticity and submissiveness, where is the piety? Well, great question, and it's one that we'll answer in the second part of this video presentation. In the meantime, I hope you have taken great notes, and I hope you will join me for the thrilling conclusion of this presentation. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the other side of the screen.